Welcome, my name is Ellen Geurts.
My name is Bahar Sakizlioglu.
Today we will have a conversation with Manuel Aalbers about financialization of real estate and housing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, financialization is the increasing dominance of financial markets, resulting in a structural transformation of economies, firms, states, and households. The latter manifests itself also for real estate and housing markets. This visualization shows us that housing financialization is marked by 1. Increasing use of housing as assets in financial markets, and 2. Increasing presence of financial actors in housing markets. So, Manuel, can you tell us about the different forms and phases then of housing financialization and give us some examples?
Yeah, good. So if we think of the different elements of the housing market, we typically think about home ownership on the one hand and about rental markets on the other hand. So let's start with that distinction. If we look at the home ownership side of things, one thing in which you could say that we see a financialization of the market is that people start to treat their home more as an investment good than they would have done in the past. Of course, this is never an absolute thing. People still treat home as well, as a place to live. Financialization is always about a process, something becoming more finance-like. It doesn't mean it's only about finance. But what we see in home ownership is that mortgage markets, so the financing of housing, has become more important over time. In the past, many people used to buy their homes with their own money. Then people started to borrow a little bit, but still brought in some of their own money. And now more and more households are depending on external finance to be able to pay their home. It seems nice that this is available. It allows people to become homeowners, but at the same time, it's also driving up prices because a lot of people get access to housing finance. They're able to pay ever more, higher prices for the housing, and then the next generation says like, we need bigger mortgages to be able to afford the housing. And then what happens? Bigger mortgages are given out. Of course, this is a bit of a simplified story, but this is more or less how there's a feedback loop between housing finance on the one hand and the prices for houses on the other hand. What we also see that mortgages are being resold in international financial markets, and that means that there's actually an interest to invest in mortgages. This, again, seems nice. It means that also mortgages become available more globally, more places around the world. But at the same time, it also means that there's actually an incentive for banks to give out mortgages, even if this might be high risk because someone else is buying up these mortgages. This was one of the reasons behind the financial crisis of 2007, 2009. Then about the rental part of things, what is important here is that we find new sets of actors coming into the rental market. So these may include private equity funds and hedge funds. They buy up large portfolios of housing, often housing portfolios that used to be social housing. So they've been privatized by national or local governments. They're being sold to these big financial institutions, and they might be buying up these units by 10,000, 20,000. And there's even examples where they buy up 90,000 units in one transaction. There's another important player here, and those are real estate investment trusts. Those real estate investment trusts also buy up housing portfolios. They often don't buy it directly from social housing organizations. Very often they buy the portfolios from the private equity and hedge funds. These private equity and hedge funds are basically in it for the short term. They buy up their portfolios with the idea we buy them for a low price and we try to resell them for a high price. These real estate investment trusts, on the other hand, they are specifically focused on renting out housing in the longer term. So they have a quite different interest. Their main idea is to make money through the rents. So they have an interest in actually propping up the rents, making sure the rents are higher. But they're usually in it for the long term, so they're not doing short-term speculation, but there's still a risk that the rents would go up a lot.
Thanks, Manuel. Could you just tell us a little bit more about how these different forms and phases of housing financialization manifest itself in different geographies?
Yeah, so it's quite particular on national regulation, for instance. So what we often see is that mortgage regulation, for instance, is something which is nationally organized. So it's often up to the national government to decide, we're going to liberalize mortgage rules. We're going to make it possible for people to borrow more. And then acronyms are being used like LTV, loan to value, how much you can borrow compared to the price of your house, or loan to income, how much you can compare to the income of the person. So those are often rules that are set by the government. So that means that in different countries we see different things. The same about mortgage securitization. This is something that you need to have national regulation to make it possible. So mortgage securitization, by definition, only happens if national governments have regulated it. So the whole idea that these things happen in the absence of regulation of any hand of the state is absolutely not true. A lot of these things are enabled by the government. And this is not just true for the home ownership and mortgage side of things, it's also true for the rental markets. We find there that, for instance, real estate investment trusts are only possible in a country if regulation has been introduced to make these types of actors possible within a country. So this is a regulation that was rolled out from the United States in the late 1960s, but it's now being rolled out throughout the world. And not just in the global north, also in the global south, there are many countries where real estate investment trusts are either regulated already, are in the process of being regulated, or are already active.
You already mentioned about it, but I would like you to elaborate a bit more on the responses to housing financialization by local and national governments.
Yeah, so there's many options different possible. Of course, we have seen recently in Berlin that there's been a referendum about renationalizing some of the housing that was sold to these private equity and hedge funds, and as well as to real estate investment trusts. There's no coincidence that this is happening in Germany. The housing privatization in Germany has gone much further than anywhere else. If we think of the role of these real estate investment trusts, there's basically no country where they are as present as in Germany. Especially in the housing market. In the office market, it's a bit different. But we also see that this is a result of the privatization by the state. So in a way, what the state is often be doing is not so much responding to financialization, but enabling it. What is now happening in Germany is that there's actually a response coming bottom up of people saying, we want to do something against the financialization of housing. What we find in some other places that governments may make policies where they say, investors, for instance, may not be buying up housing if they're planning to rent it out. If housing used to be part of the home ownership market, then it has to stay on the home ownership market. So this is regulation that's now being implemented in the Netherlands, and individual cities can then decide if they apply these kind of regulations. But there's many things, of course, that governments can do. Governments don't need to have regulation to implement securitization. They don't need to have regulation that enables real estate investment trust. Governments can also re-regulate loan-to-value and loan-to-income, thereby making it harder for mortgages to keep growing and growing. Governments can also limit monopolies. There are some discussions in some places, including Berlin again, where governments, local governments or regional governments are saying some actors in the housing market are becoming too dominant. We don't want whole neighborhoods or cities being dominated by one landlord, as we see in some German districts and some German cities. One other thing to think about is taxing vacancies. So this is another thing that's possible, making it less attractive to keep housing vacant. This is going to make less of a difference because for many of those actors, they don't keep the housing vacant. Another thing, of course, is to use zoning powers and land use powers to actually make sure that there's enough affordable housing being built, so to offer an alternative to more financialized housing. What we also see in many places around the world is the development of a lot of alternatives to financialized housing. So we can think of community land trusts that started in the US but are now becoming more and more popular in Belgium, including in Brussels, where I live. We have all kinds of other grassroots organizations, cooperatives. In Germany, you have tenant collectives. They're also popular in some other European countries. But of course, you also have old-fashioned social housing that may not be so popular anymore, but may actually be quite useful also to counter financialized housing. So I think there's many things we can do, and some governments are already doing some of these things.
Well, thank you for the very elaborate answer. I do want to ask you finally if you have a final message to pass on to urban professionals who are acting in the field of housing, real estate, and urban management.
If I would be very short, I would say do not accept the status quo. I think there is a tendency in housing and urban policies to think things are difficult to change. It's not going to happen. It's going to be impossible. There's always been housing shortages, but they've been getting worse. Housing shortages are getting worse. Affordability is getting worse. And some of it is because the wrong policies are being implemented. So I think there needs to be the political will to change some of this. But it also means that at the level of governments and at the level of development of ideas in universities by lecturers, but also by students, there needs to be more thinking about how we can change this.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for the conversation.
You're welcome.